After his departure, the rain didn't stop for weeks. His reading glasses were still on the table, waiting for eyes that would never return. The scent of her perfume, a phantom that inhabited every corner. Afternoons became eternal, the silence unbearable. Then it happened. While watering her wilting orchids, the ones she loved so much, a new stubborn shoot emerged from the dry leaves, like life itself whispering, "I'm still here." Her trembling fingers caressed that tiny miracle, and for the first time in months she smiled. Like this, if it touched your soul. It's more than a click, and it's a silent embrace between those of us who have known the void and found light again. Comment on how you think this story will end. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it costs you nothing, but for us it means the world. Thank you for being here, for reminding us that it's never too late to bloom. The cold November wind dragged dry leaves along the streets of Boston when Ethan Miller stepped out of the taxi. 5 years had passed since he was last standing in front of that house with white walls and a shingled roof. His hands, now thinner with more prominent veins, trembled slightly as he adjusted his dark overcoat. His hair, once completely black, showed silver threads at the temples, lending him an air of dignity he hadn't possessed before. The street remained the same trees, the same uneven pavement, the same houses aligned with geometric precision. Everything was identical, except for him. Ethan inhaled deeply, trying to control his heartbeat. 5 years had elapsed since he left that place, since he left behind Laura and their 2 young daughters, Isabel and Sophie. 5 years since he decided to disappear without a convincing explanation, leaving only a brief cold letter that even he couldn't reread without shame. The wrought-iron gate let out a prolonged screech when he pushed it open, a sound that echoed in the silent yard like a warning. His perfectly polished Italian shoes resonated on the stone path leading to the main entrance. He looked up at the second-floor window, and there she was. Laura Davis froze mid-motion upon seeing him. For an instant, her honey-colored eyes widened disproportionately, as if she were contemplating a ghost. Perhaps that's exactly what she saw, the specter of the man she had once loved so desperately. Her fingers released the curtain she was holding, and she vanished from the window frame. Ethan remained motionless, with the sensation that time had stopped. How many times had he rehearsed this moment during sleepless nights in anonymous hotel rooms? How many words had he practiced in front of impersonal mirrors? Now, all of them had evaporated. The front door opened slowly. Laura appeared, wearing a simple blue dress Ethan had never seen. Her brown hair, once always loose, was now pulled back in a braid that fell over her right shoulder. Her eyes, those that once looked at him with adoration, now reflected a mixture of disbelief and caution. "Laura." He tried to smile, but his voice failed, breaking on the last syllable. She remained in the doorway, like a guardian protecting the entrance to a world to which he no longer belonged. Her lips, slightly thinner than in his memories, tightened before she responded. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" she asked with surprising calmness. He had anticipated screams, reproaches, even contempt, but that serenity disarmed him completely. "To see my daughters," he replied with raw sincerity, without embellishments or excuses. Laura inhaled deeply, as if gathering strength. Her eyes scrutinized every detail of the face she had spent years trying to forget. Finally, she moved slightly aside, leaving him space to enter. The inside of the house smelled different. Before, the aroma of his expensive colognes and the cleaning products he insisted on buying predominated. Now he perceived scents of cinnamon and orange, something warmer, more homely. The walls, once decorated with abstract paintings he meticulously selected, now displayed family photographs and carefully framed children's drawings. In the living room, 2 pairs of curious eyes watched him. Isabel, who would now be 13, stood next to a beige sofa. Her black hair, identical to Ethan's, fell in waves to the middle of her back. Beside her, Sophie, 11, whose features were more similar to Laura's, looked at him with her head slightly tilted, as if analyzing him. "Girls," Laura said in a soft but firm voice, "this gentleman is—" She hesitated for a second. "Your father." The words fell like stones into a quiet pond. Isabel frowned slightly, while Sophie's eyes widened without moving. Neither ran to hug him, neither uttered "Dad." They only observed him as one observes a stranger who claims to be someone known. Ethan slowly knelt down, bringing himself to his daughter's height. His eyes moistened as he noticed the changes. Isabel no longer had the small scar on her chin. Sophie had lost the childish roundness of her cheeks. "You've grown so much," he murmured, extending a hand that remained suspended in the air, not daring to touch them. "You don't look like the photo," Sophie finally said, pointing to a picture frame on the mantelpiece where a younger version of Ethan smiled with a pregnant Laura. "That's true," he replied with a sad smile. "I've changed." Laura watched the scene from the safe distance she had established, her arms crossed over her chest, like a physical barrier that complemented the emotional ones. "Lunch will be served in a few minutes," she announced, breaking the tension of the moment. "You can stay if you want." It wasn't a warm invitation, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was an opportunity, and Ethan knew he didn't even deserve that. "Thank you," he simply replied. Lunch passed in a silence barely interrupted by the clinking of cutlery against the porcelain. Ethan tried to start conversations, asking about school, about their favorite activities, but the answers were monosyllabic or brief sentences that quickly died out. He watched how Laura served the girls first, how she discreetly cut their meat when necessary, how she gently reminded them with a look to use their napkin, gestures of a family routine that he had voluntarily abandoned. When they finished, Laura collected the plates. Ethan offered to help, but she declined with a silent gesture. The girls asked permission to leave and disappeared upstairs, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the echo of their retreating footsteps. Through the kitchen window, Ethan observed the backyard. The rose bushes he had planted were still there, although now they looked lusher and tidier. The swing he bought for Isabel's 5th birthday had been replaced by a small outdoor table with 4 chairs. 4, not 3. That detail caught his attention. When Laura returned, Ethan stood up. "I'm going to step out into the garden for a moment if you don't mind," he said. She nodded without looking directly at him. The cool air hit his face when he went outside. He felt like an intruder, a ghost trying to inhabit spaces that no longer belonged to him. He walked towards the rose bushes and delicately touched one of the buds, resisting the autumnal cold. Then he headed toward a small shed they used to store gardening tools. It was there, among empty pots and neatly arranged tools, that he saw it. A framed photograph, partially. Hidden behind some bags of soil. Ethan picked it up carefully. In it, Laura appeared, more beautiful than ever, smiling alongside Isabel and Sophie. But what made his heart stop was the 4th person in the image. A small boy, no older than 4, with intense green eyes and a smile identical to the one he himself had in photographs from his childhood. The shed door opened behind him. Laura was there watching him, and her face went pale when she saw what Ethan held in his trembling hands. "Who is this boy, Laura?" he asked, though he already knew the answer in his heart. Laura remained motionless in the shed doorway, the evening light drawing her silhouette against the threshold. Her eyes, fixed on the photograph Ethan held, reflected a mixture of fear and resignation. The wind gently moved her hair, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and faded roses. "You should come inside," she finally said, avoiding a direct answer. "It's getting cold." Ethan lightly squeezed the photo frame. He wasn't willing to let this moment pass, not when his intuition screamed a truth he needed to hear from her lips. "Who is this boy, Laura?" he repeated, this time with a firmer voice but without losing its gentleness. She closed her eyes for an instant, as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, there was determination in her gaze. "Let's go inside." The kitchen, with its white tiles and terracotta accents, seemed smaller than Ethan remembered, or perhaps it was the tension between them that was reducing the space. Laura prepared 2 cups of tea in silence with mechanical movements that betrayed how much she needed to occupy her hands. When she finally sat across from him, the photograph rested on the wooden table, like irrefutable evidence between them. "His name is Leo," she finally said. "He's 4 years old." Ethan felt the world stop. 4 years meant Laura was pregnant when he left, pregnant with a son he never knew existed. Guilt hit him with the force of an avalanche. "My God." He brought a hand to his mouth, trying to contain his emotion. "He's my son, isn't he?" Laura's eyes filled with tears. She struggled to hold back. Her fingers drummed nervously on the steaming teacup. "I found out I was pregnant 2 months after you left," she confessed, her voice cracking. "I tried to find you, Ethan, I swear, but you had completely disappeared. You changed your number, closed bank accounts, sold your shares. It was as if you had died. I thought you didn't want anything more to do with us. The silence that followed was heavy, almost tangible. Ethan remembered those months of desperate flight, when the pressure of the real estate company and the hidden debts suffocated him. He remembered how the fear of failing, of showing weakness, had pushed him to take the most cowardly way out, disappearing. "Where is he now?" he asked, a lump in his throat. "He lives with my mother, in Providence. He comes on weekends," she replied, discreetly wiping away a tear. "My mum helps me when I have to work extra shifts at the hospital." Ethan nodded slowly, assimilating the information. Laura, who had studied nursing but never practiced while they were together because he insisted it wasn't necessary, now worked in a hospital. "I've lost 5 years," he murmured, more to himself than to her. 3 children. An entire life that should have been mine too. Laura looked at him directly, and for the first time since his arrival, Ethan saw all the accumulated pain reflected in her eyes. "You can't just come back and expect everything to be fixed," she said firmly. "It doesn't work that way, Ethan." He extended a hand across the table, not quite touching hers, but close enough to convey his intention. "I'm not trying to fix the past," he replied, his voice trembling with contained emotion. "I want to deserve the future." Laura withdrew her hand, but not abruptly. It was a gesture of protection, not absolute rejection. Outside, the light was gradually fading, casting bluish shadows into the garden that filtered through the window. "Leo will be here this weekend," she finally said. "I don't know if it's a good idea for him to meet you yet. He's very small, and he doesn't understand—" "I'll wait," Ethan interrupted. "However long it takes. Just, please, don't keep him from me." Laura observed him intently, as if searching his face, looking for some indication of the sincerity of his words. The Ethan she knew, the ambitious and often cold man who prioritized business over family, seemed to have been replaced by someone different, someone with worry lines on his forehead and a vulnerability he had never shown before. "Where are you staying?" she finally asked. "At the Commonwealth Hotel, near the Commons," he replied. "I came back just 3 days ago." Laura nodded, processing the information. "You can come on Saturday at 11, she said, after a moment's reflection. "Leo will be here. We won't tell him who you are. Not yet. Just a family friend." Ethan nodded, grateful for this small concession that meant much more than he deserved. As he got up to leave, he noticed the kitchen clock read almost 8 o'clock. The hours had passed without him realizing it. "Can I say goodbye to the girls?" he asked with an unusual shyness for him. Laura hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded. "They're upstairs. First door on the right." He climbed the stairs slowly, noticing that the photographs on the wall had been replaced. The images of them in Bali or New York were gone. Now they were all of the girls at birthdays, school trips, beach days, and in many, little Leo appeared, progressively growing in front of a camera that documented a family life he was not a part of. He gently knocked on the indicated door and heard a hesitant, "Come in." Upon entering, he found Isabel sitting at her desk, in front of a tablet, while Sophie was lying in bed, reading a book. Both looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "I'm leaving now," he said, trying to smile. "I wanted to say goodbye." Neither responded immediately, but Sophie closed her book and sat up slightly. "Will you come back?" the little girl asked, with a frankness only children possess. "If you'll let me, yes," Ethan replied sincerely. "I'd like to get to know you better." Isabel, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Why did you leave?" Her voice held a barely contained accusatory tone. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. How could he explain to a child that her father ran away because he was too cowardly to face failure, too proud to admit his mistakes? "I made a mistake, Isabel," he finally said, "the biggest mistake of my life, and I've come to try to fix it if it's still possible." The girl stared at him with an intensity unsuited to her age. Finally, she nodded slightly, as if accepting his answer, though not necessarily forgiving him. "Good night," Ethan said, backing towards the door. "We'll see each other soon." When he went downstairs, Laura was waiting for him near the main entrance. She handed him a small piece of paper with her phone number. "In case you need to cancel," she explained, though both knew it was a first step towards something more. "I won't cancel," he replied, carefully putting the paper away. Stepping out onto the street, night had completely fallen over Boston. The streetlights projected circles of yellowish light onto the pavement. Ethan walked slowly, feeling the weight of the day's revelations. A son. He had a son he didn't know. Guilt and hope mingled inside him, creating a storm of contradictory emotions. When he reached a small square, he stopped and looked up at the night sky, barely visible between the buildings. The stars, which seemed distant and indifferent, reminded him how small he was compared to the universe. And yet, to 3 children, he was a giant figure, an absence that had irremediably marked their lives. "I'll make it worth it," he promised himself in silence. "I'll make my return mean something." With this renewed determination, he continued his way back to the hotel, where he would spend another night in solitude, but this time with the certainty that tomorrow would bring a new opportunity. Saturday dawned with a clear sky and a timid sun that barely warmed the streets of Boston. Ethan woke up before his alarm, with that mixture of anxiety and expectation he hadn't felt since his youth. He dressed carefully, opting for casual yet elegant clothes, dark pants and a navy cashmere sweater that softened his usually formal appearance. In front of the bathroom mirror, he carefully examined his face. The expression lines around his eyes had deepened. His perfectly trimmed beard showed more gray hairs than he remembered having the week before. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to tame a rebellious lock. What would Leo see when he looked at him? Would he recognize anything familiar in him, just as Ethan had? Recognized his own smile in the photograph? He arrived 15 minutes before the agreed time and waited in his car, parked a safe distance from the house. He watched as an older woman with completely white hair, pulled back in an impeccable bun, arrived accompanied by a small boy. Even from that distance, Ethan immediately knew it was Leo. The little boy walked with occasional skips, holding the hand of who must be his grandmother, Helen, Laura's mother. Exactly at 11 o'clock, Ethan rang the doorbell. It was Isabel who opened the door, dressed in jeans and a red t-shirt. She looked at him with less wariness than at their first meeting, but still with some caution. "Mum's in the kitchen," she simply said, stepping aside to let him in. In the living room, Sophie was playing cards with a small boy sitting on the rug. Leo. Seeing him in person, so close, triggered an emotion in Ethan that he could barely contain. The little boy had dark brown, slightly wavy hair, like Laura's, but his eyes were definitely Ethan's, intense green with small gold flecks near the pupil, a distinctive feature of the Miller family that his own father also possessed. "Good morning," Ethan greeted, trying to make his voice sound natural. Sophie looked up and nodded in greeting. Leo, however, observed him with open curiosity, without the reserve typical of adults or children who have learned to distrust. "Hi, mister," the boy said in a clear, melodious voice. "Do you want to play cards with us?" Before Ethan could answer, Laura appeared from the kitchen. She wore a simple cream-knit dress and had her hair down, falling in soft waves to the middle of her back. Beside her, Helen Davis watched him with an unreadable expression. "Ethan, welcome," Laura said, with a formality that contrasted with the intimacy they once shared. "I'd like you to meet my mother, Helen." The older woman extended her hand with contained elegance. Her eyes, the same honey color as Laura's, studied him intensely. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Ethan said, shaking her hand with respect. "The pleasure is mine," Helen replied, although her tone didn't exactly reflect pleasure, but rather an ongoing evaluation. "I've heard a lot about you." The tension in the air was palpable, but it was interrupted by Leo, who had gotten up and was now approaching them with determined steps. "Are you a friend of my mom's?" he asked, looking Ethan directly in the eyes. Ethan knelt down to be at the boy's height, feeling a lump in his throat. Those eyes, so identical to his own, looked at him without knowing the bond that united them. "Yes," he answered gently. "I've known your mom for a long time." "My name is Leo," the boy said, extending his small hand with a formality that was touching. "I'm 4.5. Ethan shook the little hand delicately, as if it were the most fragile and precious object in the world. "My name is Ethan," he replied, aware that his voice trembled slightly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Leo." The boy smiled widely, revealing an upper tooth just emerging after a baby tooth had fallen out. Then, with the unpredictability of children, he spun on his heels and returned to the rug where he had left the cards. "I've prepared something to eat in the garden," Laura announced, breaking the moment. "The day is nice enough." They went out to the backyard, where a wooden table had been set with simple yet elegant tableware, plates of salad, A freshly made tray of lasagna, and a jug of homemade lemonade made up a lunch that evoked family Sundays that never existed. The meal passed with an initial tension that gradually dissolved. Leo, oblivious to the complex emotions of the adults, chatted happily about his preschool, his favorite cartoons, and a snail he had found in his grandmother's garden the day before. Ethan listened with absolute attention, memorizing every detail, every gesture, every inflection of his voice. Isabel and Sophie occasionally participated in the conversation, still cautious but less distant than at their first meeting. Helen, for her part, observed Ethan with the meticulous attention of someone evaluating a potential threat. When they finished eating dessert, a homemade flan that Ethan remembered as Laura's favorite, Leo asked permission to go play with a ball they had left near the rose bushes. "I'll go with him," Sophie said, getting up naturally. Isabel hesitated for a moment, but finally joined her siblings, leaving the adults alone. At the table, "I need to speak with you privately," Helen said to Ethan as soon as the children were far enough away. "If you'll excuse us, Laura." Laura seemed surprised but nodded and began to collect the dishes. Helen led Ethan to a small covered area at the back of the garden, where two wicker chairs flanked a side table. The sound of children's laughter came faintly from the distance. "I won't beat around the bush, Mr. Miller," Helen began once they were seated. "My daughter suffered unspeakably when you disappeared. She spent entire nights crying, desperately searching for you, even fearing that something bad had happened to you. When she discovered her pregnancy, she tried by all means to locate you. She even hired a private detective." Ethan lowered his gaze, unable to meet the accusatory intensity in the woman's eyes. "I didn't come here to justify myself," he finally said. "I know what I did is unjustifiable." "No, it's not," Helen confirmed severely. "You left a pregnant woman with two small girls. You missed your son's birth, his first steps, his first words. You weren't even listed on his birth certificate because we couldn't find you. Leo grew up believing he had no father." Every word was like a dagger plunging into Ethan's conscience. Shame overwhelmed him, but he knew he had to listen, that he deserved every reproach. "The only thing I want to know," Helen continued with a more controlled voice, "is whether your return is permanent or if you will disappear again when things get difficult. Because if so, I ask you, for the sake of those children, to leave right now and never come back." Ethan looked up, meeting the eyes of the woman who had been more of a parent to his children than he had been himself. "I'm not going to leave," he replied firmly. "I've come to stay if they accept me. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm willing to spend the rest of my life proving that I've changed." Helen studied him in silence, as if trying to determine the sincerity of his words. Finally, she let out a long sigh. "Time will tell," she concluded, standing up. "But I warn you, Ethan Miller, I will be watching your every move. If you hurt my family again, you'll have me to deal with." With that clear warning, Helen returned to the main table, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. From there, he could watch Leo running after the ball, with Sophie and Isabel trying to intercept it. The scene, bathed in the golden light of the afternoon, seemed drawn from a dream he had never dared to have. After a few minutes of reflection, Ethan got up and walked towards where the children were playing. Leo, seeing him approach, smiled widely. "Want to play with us, Mr. Ethan?" he asked innocently. "I'd love to," he replied, feeling something inside him transforming irreparably. Leo threw the ball to him, with surprising force for a boy his age. Ethan caught it and gently returned it. Soon, a game developed in which the four of them passed the ball in a circle. Isabel and Sophie, initially reserved, began to laugh when Ethan tripped trying to catch a particularly high throw. It was in one of those moments, as Leo ran to retrieve the ball that had landed among some bushes, when it happened. The boy slipped on the damp grass and fell. It wasn't a serious fall, just a stumble, but he started to cry more from fright than pain. Ethan reacted instinctively, running towards him even before his sisters. He knelt beside the little boy and gently helped him up. "Are you okay, champ?" he asked, examining his knees and hands to make sure he wasn't hurt. Leo looked at him with eyes bright from contained tears and nodded bravely. "Just a little scared," he said, trying to smile. Ethan, without thinking, hugged him briefly. It was an instinctive, natural gesture, the kind of hug a father gives his son to comfort him. The little boy didn't resist. On the contrary, he leaned against him for a second before pulling away. "Why are you crying, mister?" Leo then asked, looking at him with genuine curiosity. Ethan hadn't realized that a solitary tear was rolling down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away with the back of his hand, surprised by his own emotional reaction. "Because I just found what was missing," he replied sincerely. Leo looked at him confused, not completely understanding the meaning of those words. Then, with the resilience of children, he smiled and picked up the ball. "Let's keep playing," he said, taking Ethan's hand to lead him back to the circle. From the terrace, Laura watched the scene with a heart divided between fear and a hope she didn't dare name. Helen, beside her, gently squeezed her hand in a gesture of silent support. "Do you think he's really changed?" Laura asked quietly. Helen kept her gaze fixed on the man who was now playing with her grandchildren, with a smile she had never seen in the few photographs she knew of him. "Only time will tell, daughter," she replied wisely. "But what I can tell you is that the man playing with your children right now is not the same one who abandoned you 5 years ago." Laura nodded, allowing herself, for the first time in a long time, to contemplate the possibility of a different future than the one she had imagined. A future where perhaps the wounds could begin to heal. The following days unfolded with the strange cadence of a life trying to find its new rhythm. Ethan established a routine of visits that started shy and brief, but gradually extended in duration and depth. Every afternoon, after taking care of pending business related to his company, he would show up at the house with a small gift: a book for Isabel, a science kit for Sophie, a toy car for Leo. Never ostentatious objects, but gifts carefully thought out, as if trying to prove that he truly knew them, or at least that he was striving to know them. Laura observed this dynamic with caution, maintaining a safe distance that allowed her to protect herself emotionally. During the first visits, they barely exchanged words beyond cordial greetings and comments about the children. However, as the days passed, the conversations began to lengthen, first about practical topics, the children's school, extracurricular activities, daily routines, and then gradually about more personal matters. One afternoon, while the children were playing in the garden under Helen's supervision, Laura and Ethan found themselves alone in the kitchen. She was preparing coffee with precise, familiar movements, while he watched her from the doorway, hands in his pockets and an unasked question in his gaze. "How did you end up working at the hospital?" he finally ventured to ask. Laura poured the hot water over the ground coffee, letting the aroma fill the space between them before answering. "When you left, I realized I needed to be self-sufficient," she said naturally, with no trace of reproach. "The house was paid for, but we had expenses." Helen offered her help, but I wanted to prove to myself that I could raise my daughters alone. She paused, stirring the coffee. "I went back to my nursing studies that I had abandoned when we got married. With Leo's pregnancy it was complicated, but I finished the degree." Ethan nodded, remembering how he had insisted years ago that she didn't need to work. "I'll take care of everything," he had told her, with youthful arrogance. Now he understood how selfish he had been, depriving her of her independence, under the pretense of love. "Do you like it? The job, I mean," he asked with genuine interest. A small smile appeared on Laura's lips as she poured the coffee into 2 blue ceramic mugs. "I love it," she admitted. "I work in pediatrics. It's exhausting, but every child who gets better thanks to our care." Her eyes shone with a passion Ethan had never seen in her. "It's worth every minute." She handed him one of the mugs, and their fingers brushed briefly. That fleeting contact, the first in 5 years, sent an electric current up Ethan's arm. Laura seemed to feel it too, because she withdrew her hand more quickly than necessary and averted her gaze toward the garden, where Leo was trying to climb a tree under the watchful eye of his sisters. "And you?" she asked after a moment. "What have you been doing all these years?" Ethan took a sip of coffee, giving himself time to organize his thoughts. How to summarize 5 years of flight, guilt, and finally, redemption. "When I left, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy," he began with a low but firm voice. "I had invested too much in a project in Miami that turned out to be a scam. We were in debt up to our necks, and he sighed deeply. "I was afraid to face failure, of you seeing me fail. So I fled to Buenos Aires, where an old college friend offered me a job in his construction company." He paused, watching Laura's reaction. She listened with a neutral expression, but her eyes revealed an old pain that had never completely healed. "I worked hard," he continued, "day and night, not out of ambition like before, but to forget, to not think about what I had left behind. Eventually, I managed to save enough to start my own project, small, sustainable housing for low-income families. It worked better than I expected. In 3 years, we had contracts throughout Argentina and started expanding into Chile and Uruguay. And why did you come back now? The question that had hovered between them since his return was finally asked. Ethan put the mug down on the counter and looked directly into Laura's eyes. Because I understood that all the success in the world meant nothing without someone to share it with, he replied simply. Because every night, before falling asleep, I saw your faces. Because I finally had the courage to face what I had done, even if it was too late. Laura looked away, her emotions raw. Rage, pain, and perhaps very buried, a small seed of forgiveness struggled inside her. "And what do you expect to find here, Ethan?" she finally asked. "What is it that you want?" He took a step towards her, shortening the physical distance between them. "I want to know my children," he replied firmly. "I want to watch Leo grow up, be present when Isabel graduates, support Sophie in her science competitions. I want to be the father I should have been from the beginning." He paused, gathering the courage for the next part. "And if someday you could forgive me enough to allow me to try to win your heart back," his voice cracked slightly. "But I understand if that never happens." Laura looked at him for a long time, with a mixture of conflicting emotions reflected on her face. Finally, she exhaled a sigh that seemed to contain 5 years of pent-up pain. "I can't promise you anything, Ethan," she said honestly. "I'm barely beginning to trust that you won't disappear again. But for the children, especially for Leo, who deserves to know his father, I'm willing to try, to allow you to be present in their lives." It wasn't a romantic reconciliation or even complete forgiveness, but it was a start, a small bridge built over the abyss he himself had created. "It's more than I deserve," he replied with sincere gratitude. A shout of joy from the garden interrupted the moment. Leo had managed to climb the first branch of the tree and was celebrating his feat with his arms raised. Ethan and Laura simultaneously approached the window to watch him, and for an instant, they were simply two proud parents sharing their son's joy. The following weeks brought about a gradual transformation in the family dynamic. Ethan rented a small apartment a few blocks from the house, a simple but cozy place where he began to host the children on some weekends. Isabel was the first to agree to stay overnight there, followed by Sophie, who initially insisted that Laura accompany them. Leo, with the adaptability typical of his age, accepted this new routine as if it had always been a part of his life. It was during one of these visits that a decisive moment occurred. Ethan had prepared an evening of home cinema with popcorn and blankets on the sofa. The movie, an animated feature about a family of superheroes, kept the 3 children completely engrossed. In a particularly exciting scene, Leo turned to Ethan with eyes bright with emotion. "Look, Daddy, the little superhero can fly." The silence that followed was absolute. Isabel and Sophie looked at their brother in surprise, then at Ethan, whose face reflected complete shock. Leo, oblivious to the impact of his words, continued to point enthusiastically at the screen. "Leo," Isabel said softly. "He's not. It's okay," Ethan interrupted, his voice trembling with emotion. "It's okay." That night, after putting the children to bed, Ethan called Laura. He told her what had happened with a lump in his throat that barely allowed him to articulate the words. "I don't know what to do," he confessed. "I don't want to confuse him, but I also don't want to reject him." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Laura spoke in a serene voice. "I think it's time we tell him the truth, Ethan. All of them." The next day, sitting in the living room of the apartment with the 3 children in front of them, Ethan and Laura had the conversation they had postponed for weeks. With simple but honest words, they explained who Ethan really was, why he had left, and why he had returned. "So, are you really my daddy?" Leo asked, his eyes wide. "Yes, Leo," Ethan replied with a lump in his throat. "I am your dad." The boy processed the information for a few seconds, his brow furrowed in an expression of concentration that made him look much older. Then, with the simple logic of childhood, he smiled. "That's why we have the same eyes," he said, as if he had just solved a great mystery. "Grandma Helen always says I have cat eyes like you." Isabel and Sophie remained silent, processing the situation in their own way. Finally, Sophie spoke with surprising maturity for her 11 years. "Are you staying this time? Forever?" The question contained all the fear and hope a child could harbor. Ethan walked over to her and took her hands in his. "I'm staying forever, Sophie," he promised, looking her directly in the eyes. "I'll never leave again." Isabel, the most reserved of the three, maintained some emotional distance, but nodded slightly, as if accepting the situation without fully committing. It was a process, Ethan understood. Trust, once broken, required time and constancy to rebuild. That night, when Laura came to pick up the children, she found a scene she never would have imagined possible months ago. Ethan sitting on the floor surrounded by his three children, building an elaborate castle with construction blocks. Leo's laughter filled the room, while Sophie directed the operation with architectural precision, and Isabel added artistic details to the towers. For a fleeting moment watching them from the doorway, Laura allowed her heart to contemplate the possibility of a new beginning. Not a simple return to the past, but something entirely new. Something built on the foundation of what they had learned, the mistakes made, and the wisdom gained through pain. When Ethan looked up and saw her, his eyes conveyed a silent message that only she could understand. "Thank you for this second chance. I won't waste it." And for the first time since his return, Laura replied with a genuine smile, small but real, like a timid ray of sunshine after a long storm. The Boston autumn gave way to a particularly cold winter. The streets were covered in frost in the mornings, and the vapor from breaths drew fleeting clouds in the air. For Ethan, however, it was the warmest winter he had experienced in years. In the 3 months since his return, he had established a routine that revolved entirely around his children. On Mondays and Wednesdays, he picked up Sophie from her ballet class. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, he took Isabel to her violin lessons, and every Friday, without exception, he spent the afternoon with Leo, exploring parks, children's museums, or simply playing at home when the cold was too intense. The small apartment he had initially rented was no longer adequate. On weekends, when all three children stayed with him, the space felt too cramped. Furthermore, Isabel, entering adolescence, was starting to need her own privacy. So after consulting with Laura, Ethan bought a house a few blocks away, close enough for the children to come and go easily, but respecting the space Laura needed. The new house had a small backyard where he planted a cherry tree, fulfilling a promise he had made to Leo to have his own climbing tree. He decorated individual rooms for each of the children, respecting their tastes and preferences. Blue tones and shelves full of books for Isabel, lime green and a small telescope for Sophie, and for Leo, yellow walls with stars that glowed in the dark. But the most significant thing wasn't the physical space, but the shared moments within it. Friday dinners, where each one shared the best and worst of their week. Reading sessions before bed. Impromptu debates about movies or books with Isabel, who showed a sharp, critical intellect, and the homemade science experiments with Sophie, whose curiosity about the natural world seemed inexhaustible. One particularly, cold December morning, while preparing hot chocolate for the children who were still asleep, Ethan received a call from Andrew Montero, his business partner in Argentina. "Things aren't going well, Ethan." Andrew's voice sounded tense even over the phone. "The government has frozen all municipal contracts until further notice. We have 3 projects paralyzed and over 200 workers in limbo." Ethan felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach. The company he had built with such effort was in danger. "How long can we hold out like this?" he asked, mentally calculating their reserves. 2 months, maybe 3 if we cut staff," Andrew replied frankly. "We need you back, Ethan, at least temporarily. Your name still opens doors that are closed to me." There was silence as Ethan processed the request. Just a year ago, he wouldn't have hesitated to take the first available flight. Business had always been his priority. But now, "I can't leave, Andrew," he finally replied. "I can't leave. My children, not again." "I understand, but let me think of another solution," Ethan interrupted. "Give me a couple of days." After hanging up, he stood looking out the kitchen window. In the garden, the newly planted cherry tree swayed gently under the weight of the frost. He then remembered a conversation he had had with Edward Vidal, an old college classmate who worked in the field of social housing in the US. Perhaps the time had come to explore new directions. The following days were spent in virtual meetings and phone calls, developing a plan that would allow him to save the company without abandoning Boston. Finally, one afternoon after picking up the children from school, he informed them that he needed to make a short trip to Buenos Aires. "You're leaving again?" Sophie asked, with a tone that wavered between accusation and fear. "Only for 10 days, Ethan explained, aware of the fragility of the trust he had managed to rebuild. "I have to sort out some work issues, but I'll be back, I promise you." Isabel looked at him with skepticism. Leo, playing with a wooden train on the rug, looked up with worry. "What if you don't come back?" the little boy asked, verbalizing the fear they all felt. Ethan knelt in front of him, taking his small hands in his. "I will always come back to you, Leo," he said firmly. "You are my home now." That night, after putting the children to bed, Ethan called Laura to inform her of the situation. He explained the company's problems and his need to travel, but also his long-term plan. "I want to move the main headquarters to Boston," he told her. "Convert our sustainable housing model into something applicable here in the US. Andrew would remain in charge of operations in South America, but I could run everything from here with you." There was silence on the other end of the line. When Laura finally spoke, her voice had a tinge of concern. "The children are scared, Ethan, especially Leo. He's been having nightmares since you told them about the trip." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. Despite his efforts, the damage he had caused years ago persisted in the form of insecurity and fear of abandonment. "I'll be back, Laura," he promised. "But I understand if you don't believe me. I failed you once." "It's not me you have to convince," she replied softly. "It's them who need to know they can count on you no matter what." After hanging up, Ethan spent hours looking at photos of his children, reflecting on the fragility of the bonds he had begun to weave. Finally, he made a decision that would alter the course of his professional life. The next morning, he called Andrew again. "I'm not going to Buenos Aires," he announced, "but I have another plan." Over the next few weeks, Ethan worked tirelessly on restructuring his company. He sold 50% of his shares to a Spanish investment group committed to sustainable housing, which provided immediate liquidity for the projects in Argentina. Simultaneously, he established a new headquarters in Boston, focused on developing housing solutions for vulnerable families in collaboration with local city councils. The process was exhausting and often frustrating, with meetings that extended late into the night. But Ethan made sure that no matter how busy he was, he never missed his commitments to the children. If he had to juggle his schedule or sacrifice hours of sleep, he did it without hesitation. One late January afternoon, while reviewing blueprints in his makeshift office, he received an unexpected call from Helen, Laura's mother. "Leo has a fever," the woman informed him with worry. "Laura is on call at the hospital and can't leave. Could you come?" Ethan didn't hesitate for a second. He left the documents on the table, cancelled the video conference scheduled for an hour later, and drove to Helen's house in a downpour. He found Leo curled up on the sofa, his face flushed with fever and his eyes glazed. Helen had placed cold compresses on his forehead and given him an antipyretic, but the little boy seemed uncomfortable and frightened. "Daddy," he murmured when he saw him, extending his arms toward him. Ethan gently picked him up and held him against his chest, feeling the heat emanating from his small body. For the next few hours, he didn't leave his side. He told him stories, gave him his medication, and when Leo finally fell asleep, he stayed beside him, watching his breathing. Helen, who had observed the entire scene from a discreet distance, approached with a cup of tea that Ethan acknowledged with a silent gesture. "You know," the woman said, sitting in the armchair across from him, "when Laura told me you were back, I advised her to close the door in your face." Ethan nodded, perfectly understanding that sentiment, "and she would have been completely within her rights," he replied, gently stroking Leo's hair, who was sleeping peacefully on his lap. "Yes, she would have," Helen confirmed, "but I'm glad she didn't." That simple sentence, spoken by the person who had the most reason to distrust him, meant more to Ethan than any $1 million contract he had ever signed in his life. Spring arrived in Boston with bursts of color in parks and gardens. The cherry tree Ethan had planted began to show its first pink buds, and Leo watched it every morning, eager to see it bloom completely. It was during one of those spring days that Ethan made another important decision. After months of reflection, he finally found the purpose that had been missing for so long. At a dinner to which he invited both Laura and Helen, Ethan presented his new project, the Laura Davis Hope Foundation, a community center dedicated to single mothers and vulnerable children, which would offer everything from temporary housing to vocational training and psychological support. I want to use what I've learned and the resources I have to help people going through difficult situations, he explained, spreading the blueprints over the dining room table. And I would like it to carry your name, Helen, if you agree. Helen, visibly moved, tried to maintain her usual composure, but her shining eyes betrayed her. Why my name? She finally asked. Because you were the one who held this family together when I abandoned it, Ethan replied sincerely. Because without you, Laura wouldn't have been able to study, work, and raise 3 wonderful children. Because you represent the strength and dignity that I want this foundation to symbolize. Laura, who had remained silent until then, took her mother's hand. It's a beautiful gesture, Ethan, she finally said, and a wonderful project. I would like you to be a part of it, he added, looking directly at her. Your experience as a nurse would be invaluable for the maternal child health area we want to develop. Laura seemed surprised by the proposal, but didn't immediately reject it. In recent months, something had changed between them. It wasn't romantic love, at least not yet, but it was mutual respect, a complicity born from their shared love for their children. I'll think about it, she finally replied. For Ethan, that answer contained more hope than any immediate yes. It meant Laura was willing to consider a future in which their paths intersected again, not as the couple they were, but as the people they had become. That night, driving back to his house, Ethan reflected on the long road traveled since that cold November day when he returned to Boston. He had made unforgivable mistakes. He had caused pain to those he should have protected the most. But now, day by day, he was trying to rebuild not only his relationship with his children, but also his own identity. He was no longer the ambitious businessman obsessed with material success, nor was he the coward who fled at the first sign of difficulty. He was simply a father trying to be worthy of his children's love, a man seeking to redeem himself through service to others. Upon arriving home, he found a drawing on the hall table that Leo had made that morning. 5 figures holding hands, Leo, Isabel, Sophie, Laura, and himself, under a cherry tree in bloom. At the top, in childish, shaky handwriting, he had written, "My family." Ethan took the drawing with trembling hands and carefully placed it in a frame that he hung on the main wall of the living room. It was the first step toward the reconstruction of something he had thought irreparably lost, a home. The construction of the Laura Davis Hope Foundation progressed quickly in an old rehabilitated industrial building on the outskirts of Boston. Ethan personally oversaw every detail, from the layout of spaces to the selection of materials, applying all the knowledge acquired during his years in Argentina. He wanted the place to convey warmth and security from the start, to be a refuge in the deepest sense of the word. One May morning, while reviewing the progress of the works with the responsible architect, he received a call from Isabel. His daughter's voice sounded tense, something unusual for her, as she had recently begun to show more openness toward him. "Dad, can you come to the school?" she asked without preamble. "It's important." Ethan felt a knot of worry form in his throat. "Has something happened? Are you okay? Sophie and Leo?" "We're fine," she reassured him. It's family day at school. Every student presents their family and tells their story. I thought maybe you could come." The simplicity of the request contrasted with the enormous meaning it held. It was the first time Isabel had actively included him in an aspect of her school life, the first time she had publicly acknowledged him as her father since his return. "I'll be there," Ethan promised, his voice slightly shaky. "What time do you need me to arrive?" "At 11. And Dad?" She paused. "Mom is coming too." After hanging up, Ethan stood still for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then, with renewed energy, he gave precise instructions to the architect and headed toward his car. On the way, he called Laura to coordinate. "Isabel called you, right?" Laura's voice had a nuance of surprise, and perhaps, although Ethan didn't want to get his hopes up, a certain satisfaction. "Yes, I'm on my way to the school right now," he confirmed. "Are you already there?" "No, I have to pick up Helen first. She's been helping Isabel with her presentation all week. Apparently it's quite elaborate." Ethan smiled at the thought of his eldest daughter and Helen working together in secret. "Do you know what she's going to talk about exactly?" "I have no idea," Laura replied. "She's been very mysterious about it. I just know it's important to her." Upon arriving at the school, Ethan felt momentarily disoriented. The hustle and bustle of parents, mothers, and relatives filling the main courtyard felt overwhelming. It had been years since he had set foot in a school environment, much less as a father attending his children's event. It was Sophie who saw him first and ran toward him with a smile that lit up her face. "Dad, we thought you wouldn't make it in time." She took his hand and led him through the crowd to an area where chairs had been set up in front of a small makeshift stage. There he found Leo, playing with other children his age, under the supervision of a teacher. "Daddy!" the little boy exclaimed upon seeing him, running to hug him. "Bella is going to tell our story, and I have a special part." Ethan picked Leo up, feeling the familiar warmth that flooded his chest every time his children called him Dad with that naturalness he had longed for. "A special part?" he asked, intrigued. "What kind of part?" "It's a secret," Leo replied, putting a finger to his lips. "Bella says I can't tell you anything." Just then, Laura and Helen arrived. The initial tension that usually accompanied the encounters between the four adults had dissipated over time, replaced by a cautious cordiality that, on occasions like this, almost seemed like genuine camaraderie. "They've been very mysterious all week," Laura commented, after the initial greetings. "Even Leo has kept the secret, and you know how hard that is for him." Ethan nodded, watching his youngest son return to playing with his friends, vibrant with energy and expectation. "Have you seen Isabel?" he asked. "She's inside getting ready," Helen replied, with a special twinkle in her eye that suggested she knew more than she was willing to share. A young teacher approached the center of the stage and welcomed everyone present to Family Day. She explained that the 6th grade students had prepared presentations about their families, focusing on what made them unique and special. The presentations began: traditional families, single-parent families, blended families, families with 2 mothers or 2 fathers. Each child told their story proudly, some with the help of posters or photographs, others with small theatrical performances involving siblings or cousins. When it was Isabel's turn, Ethan felt his heart accelerate. His eldest daughter, newly turned 13, walked onto the stage with a confidence that painfully reminded him of the young Laura he had fallen in love with years ago. Chin slightly raised, straight posture, direct gaze. "My name is Isabel Miller Davis," she began, with a clear voice that effortlessly projected throughout the courtyard. "And I'm going to tell you my family's story. It's not a perfect story or always a happy one. It's a real story, with difficult parts, but also with a lot of love." She signaled, and Sophie walked onto the stage, carrying an easel with several large sheets she had kept hidden. "This is my family 6 years ago," Isabel continued, as Sophie displayed a collage of photographs where she herself appeared as a little girl, baby Sophie, and Ethan and Laura, smiling and young. "There were 4 of us, and we lived in a nice house with a garden where my dad planted rose bushes." Sophie changed the sheet, now showing photographs of Laura alone with the girls and one of newborn Leo. "Then my father had to go away," Isabel continued, with a slight tremor in her voice that betrayed how difficult this part was for her to tell. "It was a tough time. My mother had to work and study to take care of us, and my grandmother Helen became our second pillar. And Leo, my little brother, also arrived, whom my father didn't meet when he was born." Ethan felt every word like a needle plunging into his heart. Beside him, Laura had unconsciously taken his hand, squeezing it tightly. "For 5 years, we were a different family," Isabel continued, as Sophie now showed photographs of the 3 children growing up, Laura in her nurse's uniform, Helen with them in parks and on beaches. "We learned to be strong, to take care of each other. My mom taught us that love can overcome anything, even absence." Sophie changed the sheet again, and this time showed a recent photograph: Ethan in the garden of his new house, with the 3 children and the cherry tree in bloom in the background. "And then, one day, my father came back," Isabel's voice filled with contained emotion. "He came back to stay to meet Leo, to make up for lost time with Sophie and me. It wasn't easy at first. We were angry, scared, confused." She signaled, and Leo walked onto the stage carrying something in his hands, a small pot with a miniature rose bush. "My dad explained to us that sometimes people make mistakes, even very big mistakes," Isabel continued, putting an arm around her little brother's shoulders. "But what's important is to learn from them and work every day to be better. Like this rose bush he planted for us. It needs daily care, patience, and time." Sophie changed to the final sheet, which displayed a drawing made by the three siblings. 5 figures: Ethan, Laura, Isabel, Sophie, and Leo formed a circle holding hands. "My family isn't like it was before, and it's not like other families either," Isabel concluded, with a maturity that made Ethan feel overwhelming pride. "It's a family under reconstruction. Sometimes we live with Mom, sometimes with Dad. Sometimes we all get together with Grandma Helen too. We're learning to forgive, to trust again, to build something new on the foundation of what we were." Leo, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward with his pot. "And this plant is like my daddy's love," he said in his little voice. "It grew back even though we thought it had died." An emotional silence spread throughout the courtyard. Then, like a wave that gradually swells, the applause began to resonate. Ethan felt tears running freely down his cheeks, not trying to hide them. Beside him, Laura was also crying, squeezing his hand tightly. When the 3 children came down from the stage, they ran directly toward them. Ethan hugged all 3, together, feeling his heart might burst with pure love and gratitude. "I'm so proud of you," he murmured, kissing their heads one by one. Isabel looked at him with a mix of shyness and pride. "Did you like the presentation, Dad?" "It was the most beautiful gift I've ever been given," he replied sincerely. Helen, who was observing the scene discreetly, had eyes shining with contained tears. When her gaze met Ethan's, she offered a small nod that contained more acceptance than her words had ever expressed. Summer arrived with a heat wave that turned Boston into an open-air oven. In Ethan's new house, the automatic irrigation system he had installed kept the cherry tree and the other garden trees green and lush, creating an oasis of coolness that contrasted with the scorching asphalt of the streets. The Laura Davis Hope Foundation was almost ready for its inauguration, scheduled for September. Laura, who had initially hesitated, was now fully involved in the project, contributing her medical expertise and sensitivity to design care protocols for vulnerable women. One Sunday in July, Ethan hosted a small party in his garden. It wasn't a formal celebration. He simply wanted to gather the most important people in his life in a relaxed setting. He had set up a small inflatable pool for the children, prepared a barbecue, and hung colored lights in the trees for when night fell. "I've never seen you like this," commented Edward Vidal, his old college classmate who now collaborated with the foundation. "You seem at peace." Ethan smiled, watching Leo happily splashing in the pool, while Sophie and Isabel taught him to float. "I am," he confirmed. "For the first time in my life, I truly am." That night, when everyone had left and the children were asleep, Laura stayed to help clean up. They worked in silence with the familiarity of those who have shared space and routines for years. "Thank you for letting me be part of their lives again," Ethan said suddenly while putting away the last glasses. Laura looked at him for a long time, with an expression he couldn't interpret. "It hasn't been easy to trust again," she finally admitted, "but seeing you with them, the way you look at them, how you listen to them, it's as if you're a completely different person." "I am," he replied simply, "or at least, I try to be every day." Under the dim light of the kitchen, with the sound of crickets filtering in from the garden, something subtly changed between them. There were no grand words or gestures, just a shared look that contained the promise of a possible new beginning. The inauguration of the Laura Davis Hope Foundation attracted more attention than expected. Several local media outlets covered the event, drawn by the story of personal redemption behind the project. Ethan, who normally rejected any kind of media spotlight, agreed to give a few interviews, but always diverting attention to the true purpose of the foundation. "This isn't about me," he insisted every time they tried to focus on his personal story. "It's about creating opportunities for those who need them most." In the first month, the foundation hosted 5 single mothers with their children. By Christmas, 15 families had found refuge and support in its facilities. Ethan dedicated at least 3 days a week to working there, often bringing his children after school to participate in activities with the other kids. "Why are we helping these people, Daddy?" Leo asked one afternoon, as they were returning home after spending the afternoon at the foundation. Ethan pondered how to explain concepts like social inequality and collective responsibility to a 5-year-old. "Because we can," he finally answered. "And when we can do something good for others, we have a duty to do it." Leo nodded seriously, processing that simple yet profound lesson. "I like helping," he declared after a moment. "It makes me feel big inside." Ethan smiled, touched by his youngest son's emotional intuition. Big inside. He couldn't have expressed it better. The first anniversary of Ethan's return went almost unnoticed, busy as everyone was with their daily routines. It was Isabel who mentioned it one night, during a family dinner at Laura's house. "It's been a year since you came back," she said simply, between bites of pasta. Ethan paused, surprised by the observation. Indeed, a year had passed since that nervous reunion on the porch of this very house. "It's true," he confirmed, his voice slightly shaky. "A year. And you haven't left again," Sophie added with a small smile. "And I won't leave," he reaffirmed. Laura, who had remained silent, raised her glass of wine. "I think that deserves a toast," she said with a special sparkle in her eyes, "to new beginnings." That night, after putting the children to bed, Laura and Ethan sat on the back porch, sharing the comfortable silence they had rediscovered between them. "I've been thinking," she began, hesitantly. "Maybe we could try again. Us, I mean." Ethan held his breath, afraid that any movement might break the fragility of the moment. "Are you sure?" he finally asked. Laura nodded slowly. "Not like before," she clarified. "That no longer exists. But maybe something new, something better." Under the starry November sky, they sealed that promise with a tentative kiss, the first in over 5 years. The re-emerging relationship between Ethan and Laura progressed with the cautious slowness of those who have learned to value every step of the journey. They didn't live together, nor did they make hasty plans. They enjoyed rediscovering each other as the adults they had become, so different from the young people they once were. One spring night, while the children were sleeping at Helen's house, Ethan finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been on his mind for months. "What really happened when I left, Laura?" he asked gently. "I know it was hard, but you've never told me the details." Laura remained silent for a long time, her gaze lost in the fireplace flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, devoid of the resentment that would have been understandable. "The first months were the worst," she began. "I looked for you everywhere. I hired a detective, as my mother told you. I called all your acquaintances. No one knew anything, or at least that's what they said. When I found out I was pregnant with Leo, despair mixed with a strange calm. I knew. I had to be strong for the 3 of us. Or now 4. She paused, taking a sip of tea before continuing. "Helen was my salvation. She temporarily moved in with us, watched the girls while I studied, supported me financially until I could fend for myself. And little by little we built a new normal." Ethan listened in silence, absorbing every word like a necessary penance. "The hardest part," Laura continued, "was answering the girls' questions. Where is Dad? Why isn't he coming? Doesn't he love us anymore?" I didn't know what to tell them because I didn't even understand what had happened myself. "I'm so sorry," Ethan murmured, his voice broken with emotion. Laura took his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. "I know," she simply said, "and I believe you." In that late-night conversation, the last barriers between them began to vanish, not through grand romantic gestures, but through raw sincerity and the mutual acceptance of their wounds and scars. The day of Edward and Mariana's wedding, the garden of the Laura Davis Hope Foundation, transformed into a fairy tale setting. White and gold flowers decorated a simple arch under which the couple would exchange their vows, and small lights hung from the trees, ready to shine at dusk. Ethan, as the best man, supervised the final details while Laura helped Mariana with her dress. The children, elegantly dressed, scampered among the guests with the inexhaustible energy of youth. During the ceremony, watching his friends promise to love and respect each other forever, Ethan couldn't help but look toward where Laura was sitting, beautiful in her lavender dress. Their eyes met for an instant, communicating without words everything they had lived through and what still lay ahead. Later, during the dance, when the music slowed down and couples gathered on the makeshift dance floor, Ethan approached Laura shyly. "May I have this dance?" he asked, extending his hand. She smiled, accepting the gesture. As they moved to the soft rhythm of the music, with the last rays of the sun filtering through the tree branches, Ethan leaned in to whisper in her ear, "I love you, Laura. I never stopped, even when I didn't deserve to love you." She rested her head on his shoulder, allowing herself the vulnerability she had denied herself for so long. "I love you too," she replied. "Not the man who left, but the one who came back, the one who learned to value what truly matters." From the children's table, 3 pairs of eyes watched them dance. Isabel with a knowing smile, Sophie with scientific curiosity, and Leo with the simple joy of seeing his parents together and happy. The proposal was neither grand nor elaborate. It happened on a random afternoon while they were preparing dinner together in Ethan's kitchen, moving in perfect synchronization, as if they had been doing it for years. "We should move in together," he said, while chopping carrots. "All of us, as a family." Laura looked at him, assessing the seriousness of the proposal. "Are you sure?" she asked, though her tone suggested she had already considered the idea. "I've never been surer of anything," he confirmed. "The children already spend half their time here anyway. And you, well, I think you spend more nights here than in your own house." She smiled, acknowledging the truth in his words. "I'd have to sell the house," she reflected aloud. "Or maybe rent it out." "Whatever you decide is fine," Ethan replied. "It doesn't have to be immediate. We can take our time." But once the decision was made, events unfolded with surprising rapidity. Laura's house, laden with so many bittersweet memories, was rented to a young couple with a baby. Her possessions were harmoniously integrated into Ethan's house, which soon ceased to be Ethan's house to become simply our house. The night they spent together for the first time as an officially reunited family, they celebrated with a special dinner in the garden. Under the now fully grown cherry tree, they toasted to the present and the future, aware of the value of the path they had traveled. On the 2nd anniversary of his return, Ethan organized a small family trip to Providence, where Helen had her house. Laura suspected something special was brewing, but she didn't imagine the magnitude of what Ethan had prepared. After lunch in Helen's garden, Ethan suggested a walk to a nearby hill from where the entire city could be seen. The children, who were clearly aware of the plan, insisted on going ahead, leaving the adults behind. When they reached the summit, Laura gasped. A small space had been decorated with wildflowers, and in the center, on a red blanket, lay a small blue velvet box. Ethan took her hands in his, looking at her with all the accumulated love of a lifetime. "I'm not going to ask you to go back to what we were," he said in an emotional voice. "I'm going to ask you to build something completely new, something based on who we are now, not who we were." He knelt down, taking the box and opening it, to reveal a simple but elegant white gold ring with a small emerald. "Laura Davis, would you do me the honor of marrying me for the 2nd and final time?" She, with silent tears rolling down her cheeks, nodded before she could find her voice. "Yes," she finally replied, "for the 2nd and final time." The children, who had been watching from a safe distance, then ran toward them, enveloping their parents in a collective hug that symbolized, better than any word, the completeness of the circle that had finally closed. The ceremony was intimate, held in the garden of the Laura Davis Hope Foundation on a warm June afternoon. There was no grand pomp or excess, just the closest people, the soft music of a string quartet, and the palpable emotion of those who had witnessed the extraordinary journey of redemption and love that had led them there. Isabel, Sophie, and Leo had starring roles. The girls carried the wedding coins in small wicker baskets, while Leo, newly turned 6, carried the rings on a cushion embroidered by Helen. When it was time for the vows, Ethan took Laura's hands and spoke from the depths of his heart. "Years ago, I made the mistake of abandoning the only truly valuable thing I had," he said, his clear voice resonating in the expectant silence of the garden. "Today, I promise to dedicate every day for the rest of my life to deserve this second chance, to be the husband you deserve, the father our children need, the man I should have always been." Laura, radiant in her simple ivory silk dress, responded with equal emotion. "True love is not perfect or immutable," she said, gently squeezing Ethan's hands. "It is a path traveled day by day, with its ups and downs, its lessons, its moments of doubt, and its instances of absolute clarity. Today I choose to walk that path with you, aware of our shared scars, but also of our renewed strength." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cherry tree under which they stood, like a sigh of nature blessing that reborn union. During the subsequent celebration, Helen approached Ethan with a glass of champagne in her hand. "When you came back, I told you that time would tell if you had truly changed," she reminded him with a serene smile. "I think it has spoken quite clearly." Ethan nodded, grateful for those words that represented final and complete acceptance. "Thank you for not giving up on her. On them," he added, looking toward where Laura was dancing with Leo on her feet. "For being the rock I didn't know how to be." Helen briefly squeezed his arm in an affectionate gesture before walking away, leaving him with his thoughts. Later, as the sun began to set and the garden lights turned on automatically, Ethan found Laura sitting on a secluded bench, watching the children playing with other small guests. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting beside her. She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "About how strange destiny is," she replied. "About how sometimes we have to lose something to truly value it." Ethan nodded, perfectly understanding what she meant. "The important thing isn't how many times we fall," he reflected, remembering a phrase his own father used to repeat, "but how many times we get up, and what we learn in the process." Laura interlaced her fingers with his, contemplating the twin rings that now adorned their hands. "Leo asked me this morning if we would be happy forever now," she commented with a smile. "I told him that forever is a long time, but that every day we would work to make it so." Ethan nodded, recognizing the wisdom in that answer. There were no absolute guarantees in life, only sincere promises and the daily commitment to honor them. "I think I finally understand what success truly means," he said, after a moment of reflection. "It has nothing to do with money or recognition or power." "And what does it have to do with?" she asked, although her gaze suggested she already knew the answer. Ethan looked at his 3 children who were now running toward them, their cheeks flushed from play and their eyes bright with joy. "With this," he replied simply. "With them. With us." As the children reached them, demanding their attention with stories and questions and requests, Ethan and Laura exchanged a look that contained a whole universe of meaning. It wasn't a fairy tale happy ending. It was something much better, a new beginning, built on stronger foundations than the previous ones. And when Leo, tired after so much playing, snuggled between them and murmured, "I love you," the last pieces of the puzzle clicked perfectly into place. "We love you too," they replied in unison, hugging their youngest son as Isabel and Sophie joined the family embrace. Under the stars beginning to appear in the summer sky, the Miller-Davis family, finally reunited and healed, celebrated not just a wedding, but the daily miracle of redemption through true love.